Thanks everyone for having me here. So I'm going to talk to you today about household productivity in Malawi. So this paper has largely a development economics flavor, so a bit different from what we've been looking at so far, but I hope you'll still find it interesting. The family economics literature typically asks how outside options affect intra-household allocation, but that's conditional on a given level of resources. So what I'm wondering is what if spouses' outside options can change the total amount of resources available for sharing? So essentially, what if outside options can expand or shrink the size of the pie that we have to share? So I addressed this question using data on Malawi. So in order to be specific, so in Malawi, land rights form a large part of people's outside options. And in that sense, they can be a distribution factor and affect how consumption is shared in the household. But land is also an input into production. So the more land you have, the more you can produce, and therefore the more you have to share. Now, agricultural labor can also affect the value of land. So the more you work on the land, the more valuable your outside option can be. So in that sense, labor choices can affect the value of this outside option in future periods. And as I will argue, this could create inefficiencies, as there might be incentives for people to invest in their outside options. So the general question I'm trying to address here is what is the effect of outside options on household productivity? But specifically, I'm going to be looking at the effect of different land inheritance rules on household consumption and on labor allocations in Malawi. So I have a little model to help guide intuition, but this is primarily an empirical paper. So the reason why I look at household consumption is that in particular in Malawi, it's really a measure of total resources because there's no savings. And in that sense, it shows how productive the household is. And I will look at labor allocation to see how people are making choices and whether they're making the right choices. So I claim to answer a new question, and I use kinship traditions to measure outside options in marriage, so I'll explain this shortly. So a bit about Malawi, for those of you who don't know.
Outside options change the size of the pie is kind of similar to the wage rate as well, right? So, yeah. So usually the pie is a function of the outside option.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, good point. So Malawi is largely poor and rural. So the livelihood strategies of rural households are farming and wage labor. There's a lot of subsistence farming as well. There's also very strong gender specialization. So women tend to do farming and domestic work, whereas men tend to do farming and wage labor. So really for women, there isn't much of a choice. So they do all the domestic work, and then they also work on the farm, whereas men get a choice between the type of labor that they engage in. So the main assets in Malawi for individuals are land and labor, and marriage is a crucial way of accessing these. So the reason is this. In Malawi, individuals are born into certain tribes which determine descent. And there are two types of descent. So the first type of descent is patrilineal. So this is where the bloodline is traced through the father, and this implies that land rights pass from the father to the son. On divorce, the man keeps the household land. So this means that if you're a patrilineal man, you marry a woman, she comes to you, but you have the land. And if you divorce, she has no claims on this land because it belongs to your bloodline. Whereas in matrilineal settings, which is about 60% of Malawi, the opposite is the case. So the bloodline is through the mother, which means that women pass on the land to their daughters. And on divorce, the woman keeps the household land because it belongs to her family.
Yes, what happens when someone dies? In terms of, in addition to divorce, it should have implications also? The
same, yeah. So if you're widowed, it's the same. You have no claims if your partner's the one with the land.
So in the first case, what happens if they don't have any son?
So then the land can be given for safekeeping if they have a daughter, but she never owns the land, so she wouldn't be able to sell it. So that's basically kept until she has a son, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And marriages are monogamous, or?
No. So in patrilineal, marriages can be polygamous, but in matrilineal, they're monogamous.
And when you say the land right pass from father to son, which son? Is there a rule that is the oldest son? Suppose I have two wives, two sons. How do I split?
Yeah, so there is, the first wife gets priority, but it's not, like in some settings, only the oldest son gets the land. It's not like that here. So it tends to be more fair sharing. And the other thing is that there's selection into polygamy. So polygamous people tend to be very wealthy. So you will only get extra wives if you have enough land to support all of them. Yes?
And property rights here are well established, and there is no risk of losing the land if you let it fallow up thinking.
Like in Pursuit, no.
That does not happen.
So Malawi has one of the highest divorce rates on the continent, which means that land rights matter. So marriages here are very weak, and in order to get a divorce, you just have to say that there's no more love in the marriage, and the lifetime probability of divorce is about 1 in 2. So really, you know, there's a very high turnover of marriages and divorces.
Unilateral?
Yes, unilateral. Okay, so here's a map of Malawi. So what I've done here is I've just shaded essentially the density of matrilineal households. So the darker it is, the more matrilineal households there are. So you can see a clear spatial variation. In the south is predominantly matrilineal, the north is predominantly patrilineal, and in the central region we have both. So the reason why I wanted to put up this map is just to show that there are clearly geographical factors that need to be taken into account when we look at the effect of these land rights. So just to briefly touch on the literature that relates to this paper. So the kind of concepts I'm thinking about relate land tenure, investment, and efficiency. So obviously we start with the canonical model by Pierre Andre, which posits Pareto efficiency in the household. But then, as was already mentioned in previous talks, in developing countries, this tends to be rejected quite a lot, especially on the production side. So Udry's classical paper. We have Tim Besley's paper, which argues that if there's a risk of expropriation, then there's less investment in the asset. And that's again tested by Udry and Goldstein, who find that in Ghana, women invest less in their land because of this risk of expropriation. So this is the kind of incentives we're going to be getting here. Okay, so just to summarize, so the effect of outside options on household productivity is what I'm interested in. So I'm going to measure outside options with Kinship. And I'm going to focus on Malawi, where we have these 2 descent systems, which are predetermined for each individual because it's what tribe you're born into. And to look at household productivity, I'm going to look at total consumption labor. So this question is actually interesting from a historical perspective. This doesn't really relate to family economics. But what happened is when the British colonialists and other missionaries arrived in Malawi at the beginning of the 20th century, they noticed that the southern region, which if you remember from the map is very matrilineal, was actually very poor as well. And so they immediately said, well, this must be because of the female land rights. Men, they don't own the land, and so they're deterred from investing. And so we have to get rid of this. So they tried really hard to introduce lots of policies to give the land titles, to move them from the women to the men. So luckily for our purposes, they were largely unsuccessful. But it would be interesting also to see whether we can disentangle the regional and the kinship effect. Okay, so this is really an illustrative model, so please forgive me for the simplicity. So we have a 2-period model with 2 adults, a man and a woman. So the man chooses how to split 1 unit of time between agricultural labor and wage labor. So again, based on the context of Malawi. Whereas the woman is only allowed to engage in agricultural labor. So there's no domestic work and no leisure. Now, the key thing is that agricultural labor generates agricultural income tomorrow. So this makes sense in a seasonal sense because planting and preparing the field takes place some months before the harvest can be done. And agricultural production is a function of land, so land size L, and then the 2 labor supplies of the husband and the wife. Now, between the first and the second period, there's an exogenous probability of divorce. And here we get the land rights. So on divorce, the man keeps the share lambda of the land, whereas the woman keeps the share 1 minus lambda. And that's, again, exogenously given by these descent rules.
Wait, sure. The lambda, is it the case that it's either 0 or 1, but nothing in between, or?
No, so as we'll see in the data, it is interior, precisely because of these situations where there might be no son born and so on. So, yeah.
These rules about divorce are often closely related to dowries. You know a lot of this?
Yes. Yes, so in Malawi, there's no dowry, but there's a bride price. which means that the man has to pay when he marries a woman, and that's in patrilineal settings. So yeah, I abstract away from that, but it's certainly...
And in divorce, they need to return, or?
Yes, yes. That means that a patrilineal woman will be discouraged from leaving her husband because her parents will have to return the bride price. So in that sense also, she has a very low outside option, not just because she has no land, but because her parents will just say, you can't divorce.
And this happens in both patrilineal and matrilineal?
No, no. So in matrilineal, where the women own the land, there's no bride price, and they're free to divorce as they please.
No husband price as well?
No husband price. Yeah.
But
yeah.
So you abstract from polygyny here.
Yes.
While it seems to characterize your first type of
so yeah, so I mean, in the sample, polygamy is less than 10%. So it's not like everyone is polygamous, but it certainly is an issue because instead of divorcing, you could just take an extra wife if you weren't happy. So, yeah. Okay. So the Pareto efficient allocation here maximizes household consumption. So here Pareto efficiency is equal to efficiency on the production side because we're not talking about sharing consumption. So you just maximize, here's the wage income in the first period from the husband earning. The second period we have a probability 1 minus delta of staying married, and then you just share the agricultural income that you generated yesterday. If you divorce, the husband gets lambda times the agricultural income and the wife gets 1 minus lambda.
So there is no disutility of labor?
No disutility of labor, no. So very simply, differentiating with respect to the husband's labor, you get the standard marginal condition, wages equals marginal product of labor, efficient, so all great. So now suppose that individuals behave non-cooperatively, so the husband chooses his labor allocation to maximize his own consumption. He doesn't care about what happens to the wife. So I think this is a good assumption in Malawi, where marital ties are quite weak and divorce is frequent, but we can talk about whether the same predictions can be generated in a collective model. So what I assume is that while married, the husband gets an exogenous share alpha of income, while the wife consumes 1 minus alpha. So this is really the intra-household allocation, which I'm keeping quite simple here.
Yeah, and so you don't connect that to lambda?
No, but it's also an interesting question. If alpha and lambda are correlated, then what happens then as well? Absolutely. So the husband then maximizes, so he gets a share alpha of his wage income, so he has to share his wage income while married, and similarly while married he has to share the agricultural income. But if he divorces, he keeps lambda times the agricultural production. So now he chooses labor allocation such that this holds, so we get like a wedge here essentially between the wage and the agricultural product.
Like you're putting a lot of inefficiency here because the share alpha, it's a taxation. So what you're saying is, even if I don't regard this land property right issue, this is a model in which since I know that part of the income I generate will be taxed under. Did you think of an alternative would be you have a collective model and everything is efficient, but it's Nash bargaining, let's say, and you can work out what you say at the beginning. You know, the value of my outside option will depend on how much I'm investing now.
Yeah.
So, because here, you know, you assume a lot of efficiency in the structure of the model, whereas you can think of an alternative in which a fully efficient outcome is possible, and you're comparing it. So, if what I invest in my outside option doesn't matter, then we have efficiency.
Yeah.
On the contrary, if we see that people invest in their outside option, that there is inefficiency, and we know exactly what it is. It's the fact that, for instance, I overwork just because I want to increase the value of the land, or I underwork because the land is not mine or something.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So yes, I definitely should look at that. It might make more sense than this. But that's, yeah, Pierre-Andre exactly got the intuition here. So essentially when you, the more land you get on divorce, the more you overwork, essentially. And it's compared to this alpha. So you have an inefficient choice as long as the divorce rate is non-zero, but also as long as these two, this is crucial that these two are not equal. So the tax, as you say, in marriage has to be different from the share of land you're getting on divorce.
So divorce is one way for which it will matter, but I think with relatively high HIV rates, there's also the risk that your spouse will die, and so you lose access to the land through that channel as well. So shouldn't your intertemporal choices also depend on that?
So in a sense, because the divorce rate is exogenous, it could also encompass the probability that your spouse will die. If we're thinking about more issues relating to like extramarital affairs and whether that prompts HIV, or polygamy, how that relates to HIV, I don't talk about that much here. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So in a sense, it's not just the probability of divorce, but also the risk of exercising your outside option is even higher if you take into account the probability of death, I guess. Yeah, so just to recap the intuition. So individuals invest in their outside options. The key driver of the wedge is the difference between the share of income you get in marriage and the share of land that you keep on divorce. So inefficiency occurs if consumption is shared fairly equally. So let's say alpha is close to half, but one person keeps most of the household land on divorce. So how do we relate this to Malawi? So since the Pareto efficient allocation, by definition, will maximize household consumption, it must be that any kind of wedge between the two marginal productivities will result in lower consumption. And the larger is the wedge, the lower is total consumption.
So I guess this is the same thing as, but on the marriage market, they could undo all this inefficiency, right? By pre-agreeing on how things are going to be shared.
Yeah, that's true. So you could assume if they could commit, I think you require commitment. Yeah. Yes. That's true. Yeah, absolutely. So this is a very simple calculation. So I could just compare matrilineal, patrilineal households. So I assume identical wages, identical production technology, and equal sharing in the household. So I take this from the data. So the average lambda in the data is 0.58 for matrilineal households, and 12% of the population is divorced in any given year. And then I take these numbers for the patrilineal household. So on average, they have a higher share of land and a lower divorce rate. So what I get is that the wedge is greater than 1 for both of them, but it's higher for patrilineal households. So patrilineal men should be over-investing in their land even more than matrilineal men. But again, this is very simple. Yeah.
How long is one period in your calculations?
So I take 1 year because the data is also over 1 year. So what empirical result would be consistent with this story? So we're saying that both matrilineal and patrilineal men overinvest in their land, but patrilineal men do this more. So we would expect higher consumption income for matrilineal households, more agricultural labor and less wage labor by patrilineal men, no difference in labor by women because that was an assumption of the model, and a bigger wedge between the wage and the marginal product of agricultural labor for patrilineal households. So we can talk about alternative mechanisms in this model. So it could be that matrilineal households face higher wages, so that's just drawing them towards wage labor, or that they have a better technology, so they're able to produce the same amount of agricultural produce with fewer hours, or some other reasons. Okay, so the two questions that I look at in the empirical analysis are, what is the effect of kinship on consumption, and what is the effect of kinship on labor allocation? So kinship is whether the household is matrilineal or patrilineal. So as I argued already, it's exogenous to individuals' behavior, but is correlated with lots of things, primarily geography, but other things such as income earning opportunities, wealth, and so on. So this is just mostly harmless stuff. So a regression of consumption on kinship will give a causal effect as long as once we condition on all our observables, the only difference in consumption outcomes relates to kinship. So what do I do? So on the left-hand side, I've got log consumption. This is total household consumption for now. I've got a dummy variable for whether or not you're patrilineal. I've got geography, other economic variables, and then other household characteristics. And then I do the same thing for labor allocation, but here I've just got hours of different types of labor in the sample. And I do OLS, clustering, household weights, standard survey stuff.
Is the labor male labor or female labor or both?
So in the regressions, I just report male labor, but yeah, I can do both. Yeah. So I used the Malawi Living Standards Measurement Study, which some of you might know from Krishna Pandakar and Arthur Lubel's paper. So we start with 12,000 households. I only want to keep married and rural people, so I end up with a final sample of 7,161 households. So to get the consumption aggregate, it's deflated. We've got food purchased, Crucially, we have food produced. So we have the value of how much they eat from things that they've grown. Then we have the food that they eat from gifts, non-durables. We value their durables. We've got housing, schooling, and health as well. And for descent, I use the answer to this question. So do individuals in this community trace their descent through their father, through their mother, or both? Yeah, so I should mention there's a very small number of villages that have both types of descent, about 15 villages. So I just have another dummy variable for them, but I don't spend too much time looking at them.
So durable there is livestock?
No, livestock is not in there. So durables would be like furniture, electricals, that kind of thing.
What did you do with livestock?
Livestock is not, wouldn't consider it as consumption. So it would be more like an input into production. So I don't include it in the consumption aggregate.
But it's not, but it's also property, right?
I see, okay. So you think it should affect the outside option?
Cattle is a big thing in Malawi.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I should look at that. So just some summary stats. So really the purpose of this table is to say that these guys are not that different except on geography, regional characteristics, and on the divorce rate. So patrilineal guys divorce a lot less frequently, and that might be because of the presence of polygamy, which gives you another option if you don't like your wife very much. Land ownership. So if we look at the bottom table, the bottom row.
Is there a remarriage market?
Yes, very, very common.
These women who are in the patrilinear have basically no incentive to just leave their husband, or they could just go back on the remarriage market and
they could. Yeah, they could, but it's a lot harder for women to remarry than for men. So if you look in the sample of singles, most of them are women. Yeah, so that's the problem. So total land is not significantly different between the two types of households, and neither is the fraction of that that's jointly owned or owned by others in the family. But if we look at husbands and wives' land, there's a significant difference. So husbands own much more land in patrilineal, whereas wives own much more land in matrilineal. OK, and now finally some summary stats on expenditure, and then I'm going to get to the regression results. So this table largely addresses the thing I was talking about with regards to the colonialists. So I split the sample based on north, central, and south, and then also by patrilineal and matrilineal. So first of all, if you compare the regions in the fourth column, you see that the south is indeed the poorest, so just like the colonialists observed. But if you look at the bottom row, you find that actually matrilineal households are wealthier, and indeed that's the case in all three regions. So it does look like the poverty of the south is being driven by patrilineal households, and indeed in the central region too, rather than matrilineal households. And so now the question is to what extent that's driven by geography or whether it's driven by the land rights. Okay. So these are the control variables that I use. So in the baseline, I've got basic characteristics of the household, household size and region, amount of land, and I've also got the month of the interview, so to take into account seasonality over the year. For geography, I have a lot of variables, so several capturing soil quality. Greenness, which is like spring, so the longer is spring, the more things grow. Then we have temperature and rainfall also. I've got household composition, economic variables, so this is kind of to capture the strength of the village economy, so what kind of employment, whether there's a lot of immigrants coming into the village, the distance to the road, and what crops are farmed. And then I've got also some variables capturing gender. Okay, so now I'll come to the key results for consumption. So the key result is that patrilineal households have significantly lower consumption than matrilineal households, and I haven't managed to break that result by adding any number of control variables. So in the raw data, it's about 15%, but if you look at column 3, and when we add geography, that falls by about half. So about half of the difference is explained by the fact that matrilineal households are locating in the best geographical areas of each region. But the result is largely robust at about 10%. So it does look like the patrilineal guys are producing less. So I've done lots of robustness checks on this result. So the first thing I look at is to use alternative measures of consumption. So this is per capita equivalent expenditure, which takes into account the fact that children eat less than adults. And then purchases on the final column, the idea being that if wage income is really important, then you should have more cash, and therefore you should be able to purchase more. So you can see that the result is strong in all three of those.
You've probably said that already, but I missed it.
Sure.
Is the time allocated by men different in the patrilinear and the matrilinear?
Yeah, so I'm going to come to that after consumption. I'm going to talk about labor.
Yeah, okay, because is it obvious that in the patrilinear land there should be less produced? Can't we just have a different allocation of time that will...
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm going to look at income as well to see if I can get at the actual amount that's produced. Yeah. So some other robustness checks. I use alternative measures of wealth here. So this is like roof quality and number of livestock. Here I restricted to the southern and central regions only, because if you remember the map in the northern region, there weren't that many matrilineal households. In column 10, I had GPS, so again, trying to get a geography a bit better. So I've got latitude, longitude, their squares, and their interaction as well. And then in the final column, I try to get at tribal fixed effects. So there's this idea that maybe what I'm capturing is that these tribes are harder working, or historically somehow have ended up with a higher ability. So I don't know which tribe each household belongs to, but I know which language they speak at home, which is highly correlated with the tribe. So the final column has language fixed effects in addition to the patrilineal dummy. So you can see that even when I add these fixed effects, the dummy is still significant. So any explanation on top of that would have to be that all patrilineal tribes are harder working, or less hard working, or all patrilineal tribes have lower ability. Other alternative explanations, so savings, maybe matrilineal households have higher consumption today because they're saving less, tomorrow they're going to be poorer. But this doesn't come out in the data, mainly because these guys just don't have savings. They're so poor that they consume everything. Religion, colonial influence, so I take measures from Nan and Vanchikon's paper, and population density. None of these seem to explain the result.
This is total household consumption. If you do per capita?
Yeah, so that was on the previous slide. That's the same, yeah. It's okay. So that's consumption. So we've got this kind of consumption result. And now the question is whether we can explain it. So now hopefully I'm going to get at Costas's question. So labor hours per week. So first I'm going to talk about wives because I don't do any regressions on them. Primarily because the summary stats show that there's no significant difference between the two types of households. So agricultural labor is about the same, and you can see here that they really do, this is per week, so less than half an hour per week on wage labor. So it seems like the assumptions that I made at the beginning make sense. So for the husbands, total hours, it looks like matrilineal husbands are working slightly harder, which may be a bargaining power effect. When we look at agricultural labor, doesn't seem to be any difference. In wage labor, they're doing significantly more. So the matrilineal guys are doing significantly more hours. So the question is now whether once we control for lots of things, these differences persist.
But still very low, right?
Yeah, per week. So yeah, they still largely do work on agriculture.
So this wage work, I mean, I go and work in somebody else's field. Do I go to the city? What's the wage?
So it's largely like little tasks like bricklaying, or it can be migrating to the town, but it's less skilled than that. And it can be working on a local farm sometimes as well.
And is this a bunch of zeros with some men doing a kind of full-time, what we might call full-time wage work, or is it all kind of?
No, it's nicely distributed, yeah. Okay, so these are the regressions for husbands' labor hours. So you can see here, in patrilineal guys, they do about 1.5 hours more per week of agricultural labor and about the same amount less of wage hours, and obviously then the difference is significant and the sum is not. So it looks like there is a substitution effect for these guys going on.
So the reason why it might matter whether it's inheritance or divorce then is you don't need non-cooperative behavior to explain why you fear losing your land. because your spouse dies, you might want to diversify in other activities, even if you're fully cooperating with your spouse.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, so I just check what's going on with income. So there's a gap in income and there's a gap in wage earnings as well. So again, consistent with the consumption side, but also consistent that they're making a different labor allocation, which is leaving them worse off at the household level, right? So there's a difference between what's going on at the household level and what's going on at the personal level. So these husbands are making inefficient choices for the wife, but for them it's better. And yeah, I just checked what's going on with son's labor supply because it could be a skills story. So suppose you're a patrilineal man and you know you're going to give the land to your son, well then you want him to acquire lots of skills working on the land. And in that sense, once he gets the land, he'll be better at tilling the land than a matrilineal son. But there doesn't seem to be anything going on with the sons in the sample and no differences in labor allocation.
What about educational attainment?
Educational attainment? It's about the same for both. Yeah, so there doesn't seem to be any difference in, but there is a difference in spending, which I think I have time to look at. Yeah, so just the final thing on the labor supply. So to kind of get at this wedge between the marginal product of agriculture and the wage, I calculate a predicted wage. So this is from a Heckman selection model for all husbands in the sample. I also calculate the average product of agricultural labor. So this is the total production divided by the total number of household hours. So for obvious reasons, I can't do the husband's productivity because I don't know which part was produced by him. So this is divided by the hours that everyone puts in. So what you can see is that, first of all, that the wage is actually higher on average among patrilineal husbands. So it's not that the matrilineal men are being drawn towards a higher return. And when we look at the average product of agricultural labor, these are medians, by the way, it's very similar, but the matrilineal men have a slightly higher slightly higher product, which again is consistent with this kind of more general equilibrium idea. So the matrilineal men are doing less agricultural labor, so their marginal product is higher. They're also doing more wage labor, so in equilibrium, wages have come down in those villages. And yeah, I just calculated the ratio. So it does look like the wedge is bigger among patrilineal men. And this is for comparison a public works program wage, just to show that the Heckman is not way off. Okay, so that's all the results I want to present relating to the model. So
they all have access to this public works? Is the workfare program or?
No, so this is only in the villages for which is available, which is about a third.
And it's a welfare program?
Yes, it is. It's like social security. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about intra-household allocation. I think it's interesting also to look at, even if it's not the main topic of the paper, to see whether the kinship rights affect how consumption is shared in the household. So it does matrilineally benefit everyone in a household fairly. So what I do is I estimate a series of working laser expenditure functions. So the reason why I don't do a full demand system is because I don't have prices for everything. So I have prices for about 50% of goods. So I've got them on the right-hand side, all the prices. Here, this is just the share of expenditure that's spent on the various private goods. This is total, this is per capita expenditure, which is instrumented with wealth. So I use household construction material and the number of livestock. So what's going on in summary stats? So I look at daughters' education, spending on daughters' education, spending on sons' education, women's clothing, and men's clothing. So in the summary stats, the only difference is in sons' education. So it looks like patrilineal households are spending a larger share of their consumption on sons' education. But these percentages are very small, so they're all about less than 1% of spending. So these are the working laser results. So the significant effects are for sons' education and for women's clothing. So patrilineal men spend significantly more on sons' education as a proportion of their resources and significantly less on women's clothing. So this is kind of consistent with kinship also shifting the bargaining power in the household. And the results for per capita expenditure show that both sons' education and men's clothing are luxury goods. Yeah. Okay, so I'm actually done early. So I used exogenous descent systems in Malawi to examine the effect of spouses outside options on household productivity. So I controlled for a whole host of things. The great thing is that this data has lots of variables for geography. So what I showed is that patrilineal households, where men in most of the land have 10% lower consumption, and that's also associated with more agricultural labor and less wage labor. So the intuition that I'm trying to get at in this paper is that individuals are investing in their outside options, and this is creating some inefficiencies. So I would recommend fair land rights and equal income opportunities. And thank you for listening. Any further questions?
So the main reason why the patrilineal households are poorer because they don't take the advantage of the wage income. That's my
argument. Yes.
One question. When you say, I don't remember, when you control for crop types, is it the actual crop they calculate, or is it crop suitability of whichever land they have?
So it's the crops that are cultivated by other households in their village, not them. So it's basically predominant.
Because of all this geographical clustering, I'm wondering whether it would also make sense to look at differences, systematic differences in suitability in different crops. You know, something like soil type or proxies for that in some way.
Yeah, so I have the characteristics of the soil, but I haven't matched that to what would be good for which crop.
I guess in principle it would be nice maybe to go, and maybe you've done this already, to look at patrilineal versus matrilineal within the same geographical area somewhat, right?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Because, I mean, clustering was so strong on the map.
That's right.
Maybe bordering areas, I don't know, something like this.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand your interpretation in terms of inefficiency. Think of a model in which people maximize the weighted sum of utility, but the weight depends on the matrilineal versus patrilineal. So you would expect that when the husband has more weight, the behavior is different. And there is no reason to call that inefficient. It's just that, you know, he works less and...
Maybe he really doesn't like work.
Yeah, exactly.
So we don't know what his disutility is.
So there's no difference in leisure hours. There's no difference in leisure hours between the two.
Yeah, but it may be that the subjective cost, the disutility of wage labor is much higher than
that is true. Yeah, absolutely. So that is another thing that can happen.
Yes, and when they meet, because they have so vastly different outside options, you will expect different allocations of both time and consumption. So it would be nice to work out what kind of a marriage market would imply, and whether it could, you know, an efficient marriage market with an efficient inter-household allocation would imply about these. Yes.
So in other words, it could simply be that depending on the land, the property rights, what household maximizes is not the same function. But in both cases, they maximize the weighted sum of utility, but the weights are not the same. And if the weights are not the same, and if there is something like a disutility of labor, then I would expect the model like
the same result.
But of course, you'd start with the same preferences for individuals, right? Otherwise, it might be cheating.
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Do you know what their wage is, like their hourly wage, rather than their total wage income?
Yeah. So. Yeah, I think I had that up. So, well, I know for those people who work, and so then using a Heckman, I can predict it for everyone.
And is it similar across the matrilineal and the patrilineal?
It is similar, yeah. It's slightly higher for patrilineal husbands.
The wage?
The wage, yeah. Yeah, okay. Any more questions? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Other questions?
Thank you.